Welcome back to Sex and Space. I'm Toshi, and today I had a conversation with David J., the founder of the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, which is the world's largest online asexual community. We had a conversation today about the experience of being asexual and the societal expectations that are placed around sexuality, the way that David has redefined relationships and intimacy as an asexual person, what it's like being part of a three-parent family, and the importance of creating communities of care. And we finished our conversation with a discussion about why conflict is actually a really good thing. Let's get into the episode. So welcome, David, to the Sex and Space podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today for a conversation about asexuality. Really excited to have you.
Oh, I'm very excited to be here.
And I thought maybe for our listeners, we could start by having you introduce yourself and what it is that you do.
So my name's David J. I use he/him pronouns, and I chair the board of the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, which is one of the world's oldest and largest communities of people who identify on the ace spectrum. Ace is sort of a slang term for people who are asexual, demisexual, and gray A. We also have a lot of aromantic people in our community.
And for anyone who's tuning in, and this might be the first time they've come across the term asexuality or ace, can you sort of unpack what that means for our listeners?
Sure. So I identify as asexual and aromantic. That means that I don't experience sexual attraction. So I still have a desire to connect with people. I still have a desire to form intimate relationships, and I form many really wonderful, powerful, intimate relationships in my life. I also still have a desire for physical touch. Those things just don't kind of point towards sexuality for me. In addition to being asexual, I'm aromantic, which means that I'm not really drawn to romantic scripts like dating. My relationship style is a little more like intentional friendship. And when we talk about the ace community, we're really talking about a wide range of people somewhere on that spectrum. So there are people who are asexual and romantic who do feel this desire to date. There are people who are demisexual who maybe experience sexual desire, but only once a relationship has become fairly close and mature. They're not sexually attracted to someone right at the beginning. And often don't know if they will be. There are people who are gray A, who are somewhere on the spectrum between asexual and what we call allosexual or normatively sexual. So I kind of have one place I come from in the community, but there's a pretty wide range of experiences, all of people who I'd say are butting up against the idea that we need sexuality to be happy. We need sexuality to form relationships that matter. And I think in a million different ways, people in a community are discovering and exploring and proving that we can live really full, powerful, emotional lives with as much or as little sexuality as we want.
And I think that kind of really ties into my next question, which is about compulsory sexuality, which is, maybe I'll let you explain that actually, if you'd be happy to.
So I want to give a shout out to Sharonda J. Brown, who wrote Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, a Black Asexual Lens on a Sex-Obsessed Culture, which is a phenomenal book. And compulsory sexuality is this mix of stories that we get told that say that if you are not sexual, you're not enough. If you're not sexual enough, you won't ever have a partnership. You'll be alone forever. If you're not sexual enough, you're not really a man, woman, whatever your gender identity is. If you're not sexual enough, you're not fully human. There's a lot of really negative stories that get thrown around about people who are not sexual enough. And I know I've struggled with that. As a young ace person, I really felt like I was broken back when I was in high school because there were so many stories. And compulsory sexuality sort of says you're broken, and then a lot of what we do as a community is push back against that.
And so when you were, in high school and kind of going through that and trying to navigate that, I guess, like battling against that societal expectation and all that kind of messaging, how did you do that? How did you navigate that?
So I grew up in the States. I grew up in the middle of the United States in the Midwest. And in the city called St. Louis. And I really started in this place of feeling really broken, feeling really scared I was going to be alone forever. And I felt like there was something wrong with me. Like I wasn't experiencing sexuality. That was a problem that I needed to understand and fix somehow. Uh, and I was really fortunate that there were queer kids and queer elders around me, and people who were exploring at that point being gay, being bi, and they kind of took me aside and they said, look, if you're different, that doesn't mean that you're broken. Maybe that means that the stories you're being told are broken. And that was one of the first times that's when I started thinking about asexuality. I'd kind of made up a word to describe myself. I never talked to another person like me. I was really scared. And that encouragement was enough to help me imagine that, like, maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe this was a way to be, and maybe I could figure out for myself how to form relationships that worked for me. And what I didn't realize at the time, so I'd invented this word, I didn't realize there were thousands and thousands of other people all struggling with very similar challenges, all inventing the same word at that time.
Yeah.
And we'd kind of yet to find one another.
And
This was in the late 90s.
okay. And there was something that you mentioned, it was an interview somewhere, and you were talking about the different expectations, like sexual expectations that get placed on different bodies. And I wondered if you could talk us through what that was like for you in terms of the expectations that you felt that were placed on you.
So I think this has been something that's been really powerful about my understanding exploring ACE community is I'm a white cis man. I'm normatively abled. Now I'm in my 40s, but then I was in my 20s. I'm fairly conventionally attractive. So people expected me to be sexual. They expected me to be sexual in a particular way that they expect young, conventionally attractive, fairly economically privileged cis men to be sexual. And so when I broke those expectations, when I wasn't sexual in that way, there was a way that people told me that that wasn't okay and that I was broken and that I needed fixing. The way those expectations were put on my body are really different than the way they were put on the body of friends of mine who were Asian American women. Really different than they were put on the bodies of friends of mine who were Muslim women. Different than they were put on the bodies of disabled folks in our community, of neurodiverse folks in our community. And so what I've learned about aceness is that you're almost always told that there's something wrong with you, but what is considered wrong with you really is different depending on what kind of body you show up in without the sexuality that people expect.
And how do you think it's shaped the way that you view relationships and intimacy?
Oh man, so profoundly. And I think for me, ultimately in a really, really liberating way. So I spent a long time, like I said, being afraid that I'd be alone forever. Looking at this institution of dating. That was how my friends were meeting their needs for intimacy and saying, like, I'll never be enough. I'll never be enough for a partner. No one will ever want that kind of relationship with me. So what can I ever expect in life? And then I began to explore inviting deeper levels of intention into my friendships. I began to see a relationship not as this kind of script where you date someone and then you marry them, but it's just an understanding I had with another person of how we spent time together. And I started forming all of these different beautiful relationships. And then I would go on walks with people and I'd say, look, this is the unique role you play in my life. This is why I'm really, really grateful that over the past 2 years, we've become an important part of one another's lives. And those relationships those conversations that started in gratitude would often get to a place where we'd become more committed about the stuff we were already doing. We had a little bit of a habit together. Now it was a thing that was a commitment. And it wasn't that it couldn't change, but if it changed, we would stop and talk about it. If they started dating someone, they wouldn't just ghost me, They would say, oh, you were a serious committed relationship in my life. I'm going to sit down and talk about how a relationship changes to make room for this person I'm dating. And that was really transformative. And that was what allowed me to begin to experience the kind of stability, the kind of commitment that my friends who were dating were experiencing. But it was really liberating, really different, because instead of relationships that needed to fit this script, every relationship I got to ask, what does this relationship want to be? What's the thread we found together? Like, maybe we really share a professional and creative passion, so we get together and we're super intellectual. Maybe we have a hobby we really love. Maybe we have a deep love of the outdoors, so we get together and we hike. Like, each relationship sort of grew in a totally different direction, and then together they summed up to kind of make this beautiful life for me. And if I wanted to add to that life, I could add new relationships to it. And that became this just really beautiful place of agency, where I started to feel like, oh, I can't control them, but I can invite in relationship to do almost anything. And as someone who was at that time building a movement of asexual people, like, thinking about how to build relationships also built a lot of collective care and a lot of collective power.
And how would you find people would respond to having those kinds of conversations? Because I imagine at some point for some people, it might have been the first time someone had kind of, invited them to think about, their connection or like relationship with them in that way.
So not everyone was into it. I think some people really needed this separation between their friendships and their romantic partnerships. And when I started to be intentional in a way that felt a little like a gray area, they were like, nope. And so I would give people a heads up a week, 2 weeks beforehand. I'd say, look, here's the thing I like to do with people I care about. I want to go on a conversation. I want to go on a walk. I want to have this conversation. And like, does that feel right to you? And if it didn't, then we wouldn't do it. But some people were really intrigued. Some people really, really liked it. And I found that out of those conversations, suddenly there was a way to talk about the relationship in the relationship in a way that had previously been limited to people's romantic partnerships. And that opened up a lot of possibilities for them. I was connected with a lot of like femme folks who were like, oh, all my relationships with male-bodied folks feel like they center around sexuality, or have to be managing sexuality. So having something where I get this intimacy and this commitment without that is really, really liberating. Having relationships with couples where they could say, oh, we get kind of, I become really close with both sides of a couple. And then they would say, oh, there's things that we don't do in our relationship with one another because we can't, no partner can do everything. But here's this other intimate relationship we can form that lets us do a lot of what we're missing.
And I
So
think
it wound up being really fantastic.
I think it's one of those things when I was, doing some research for this podcast and thinking about the way that I show up in my own relationship with people. I was thinking about it. I was like, well, there is, like you say, this kind of script for romantic relationships, and there's certain, expectations about the conversations you'll be having. And for some reason, for so long, or for, so many people, that doesn't translate into friendships and other kinds of relationships and I think that kind of leads into another question I have in terms of the way that we kind of have a hierarchy of relationships in our mind. And so I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of like how being ace has like shifted that in your head.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that romantic relationships and professional relationships, I think, are the ones that we're told to prioritize.
Yeah.
Because there's this narrative that eventually those are the ones that are going to matter, right? Your career and your family and everything else is sort of going to be nice, and it's going to fall by the wayside. And what I found is that that's missing something really important that we've had for most of human history, which is the idea of a community of care. So like, to fast forward a little bit, one of those couples that I like escalated into intentionality with invited me to raise a kid with them. which I'd always known I wanted to be a parent. This was a
Yeah.
huge, huge dream of mine, right? And in 2015, they invited me to co-parent with them. We spent 2 years talking about what it would look like. In 2017, we had our first kid. We just had our second kid
Amazing.
last year. And in California, I can legally be we're all on the birth certificate. So we have this really, really beautiful family, but our relationships with one another are not enough, right? For most of human history, when we've raised kids, we haven't done it as just two people. We've done it as a community of people. And as we invested in our relationships with one another, we also invested in what's the community of people around us that are going to show up and help us in caring for our kid? What's the community that we're going to show up for and help?
Yeah.
That are going to let us continue to be ourselves as we become parents, that are going to show up when we need support. And if we think about, if you're in your 20s, you're in your 30s, you're thinking about having a career, forming a family, I would say a third thing that I wish people thought about with the same level of intentionality is, how do you build that community of care that's going to be with you through your life? Because I think it's one of the biggest factors for our long-term happiness, our long-term health, our long-term agency, to have and really invest in that community.
I think too, because the perception that one person can meet all of your needs and that will be enough is it's just not true. And I think that, our relationships offer us so many different things. Different people offer us different, kind of like what you were saying before, someone might be the person you go on nature walks with. Someone might be like a, person that you talk about creative work with. And something I was wanting to know as well was, being in a 3-parent family, how has it impacted the division of labor between all of you?
So I think in a lot of ways we're more equitable than a lot of 2-parent families are. I think there's a way that labor kind of becomes gendered and shifts in an unequitable way in a lot of families. And for us, because there were 3 of us, we had to figure things out from scratch. We just were a lot more intentional. That also reflects this intentionality that we bring to relationships. So we have a shared calendar for our kids where we divide up childcare shifts to make sure that we're evenly distributing the work of sort of being on primary childcare. We have a regular time to come together and check in about things like how housework is being done.
Yeah.
To make sure that it's equitable. So there are, I think, ways that we're able to take things and divide them by 3. We track all of our finances to make sure they're equally contributing in a way that I think many families are less intentional and therefore wind up less equitable.
Are there any misconceptions that you feel people have about 3-parent families that you find yourself kind of having to address?
I think that sometimes there's a misconception that I'm less of a parent because I'm not the biological parent. Avery and Zeke are married. They're the biological contributors to our kids. But we all live together. We're all legal parents. We all evenly divide the work. We are equally recognized as parents by our kids.
Yeah.
And so I think there will be people who will kind of be uncertain if I'm like an uncle or like they will struggle to put me in the place of parent. But I think when we start to explain how our family works, and when people come over and see our family, it's really, really clear that the kids are running between the 3 of us. Like one of us is cooking, one of us is watching one kid, one of us is maybe both kids, one of us is clean. Like we are kind of managing the home, holding the home together. And that's also really liberating because we just have a lot more time than 2-parent families do, right? Like we get to have more active communities. Avery and Zeke have a lot more time for their marriage. We can have time for hobbies, like a lot of things that parents in this, I think, very isolated 2-parent norm that at least is true here in the States for a lot of folks. People just don't have time for anything other than their job and their kids.
Yeah.
And that's really really horrible. I think it's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the kids in the long run.
Yeah. Is there, if you were to think of like one thing that you think people could learn from this about, three-parent families and building communities of care, what's one thing that you'd want them to know?
I'm going to cheat and say two things.
Okay, yeah. Love it.
The first is the power of intentionality and breaking scripts. So some of the most powerful moments for me in relationship have been the moments when I realize I'm not gonna like date somebody. We it's like we're going down this path, and maybe they're excited about like a romantic sexual script. I'm not, but maybe they are, right? And it's like we're going down this path and we hit a place where a tree has fallen in the road. It says, okay, we can't proceed here. We're not going to go towards this romantic sexual direction.
Yeah.
And the instinct is to say, oh, well, if we're not going there, then there's a waste of our time. We might as well like go back, give up on the relationship. And there's a way that I can you turn to the side of the path and you shine a flashlight in the woods and you say, we can go that way. And you stop listening to what the script is asking you to do and you start listening to what the relationship wants. What's it telling you about how to spend time together? What's it telling you about how to be joyful, be affectionate, be grateful, challenge one another? What are the things you've discovered that you need to that relationship? And how do you honor them, whether or not it involves romance, whether or not it involves sexuality? There's a lot of really powerful discussions in the ace community about like all of the ways that we don't allow ourselves to experience touch when all touch is considered a path to sexuality.
Yeah.
But if we ask ourselves what kind of touch a relationship wants, even if it's not sexual, then we can have more of that in our life. There's so many, I think, things like that. So this like being willing to break the script and be intentional about it and be curious is the first thing. And I think the second thing that really comes to mind is the importance of transitions.
Okay.
These like moments in our life, graduating undergrad, having a first kid, moving to a new city, moments where we've kind of had a understanding of how to build relationship, how to build friendships, maybe we've had a community, and suddenly that understanding of how to be in a relationship doesn't work anymore. Suddenly our community's not there. Or our understanding of how to connect with that community is disrupted.
Yeah.
And so really thinking about how do we prepare for, how do we get supported through those transitions? Because I think those are the moments when people either become isolated or feel like, oh, I went through a transition, suddenly I'm lonely. My only option is to form a partnership and like put everything in that person. And kind of having a plan and having a support network for how we build and maintain a community of care through transitions. And then like a partner can be part of that. A partner can complement that in a beautiful way, but you're not putting everything on that person.
Yeah. And if someone is listening and going, I really want to start being more intentional in my relationships, but I don't know how to start, would you have any advice?
So experiment with like having those kinds of conversations that I talked about. That is also, by the way, super scary. It's super scary to bring that up with a friend. So, one thing I've found is powerful is when my friends would start like gossiping's not quite the right word, but they like talk about they'd be like, I went on a date with someone or I'm dating someone. Here's what's going on. Like people get together and just talk about their relationships. Like I would talk about my non-romantic, non-sexual relationships in those same conversations. I like treat them as important as worthy of like group processing time. And there was something about that, like my journey to find co-parents, I would treat as important as worthy of group processing time as other people's dating adventures. And there was something about that just like gave me permission to think about it and take it seriously. That was really helpful. And it was a lot easier before I like talked to the person I was in a relationship with. It was a lot easier to talk to someone else about the relationship is important.
Okay.
And so creating a place where I could do that really helped.
And I think one thing I wanted to sort of touch on as well is because, I mean, in Western society, we privilege sexual relationships so much. And so in terms of navigating like, connection and loneliness, I imagine it's sort of like a different kind of, to navigate it differently when, sex isn't the way that that's happening. And I wondered how, ace people make sure that they are receiving the connection that all humans need.
I mean, it's a struggle, right, for us, like it is for everybody. And I think it's a different kind of struggle
Yeah.
because so much of the infrastructure of intimacy is just not built for us, right? The self-help books, the apps, the like people who want you to date, the understanding among your partners of like what meaningful intimacy is, like getting people to realize that a relationship has potential, I think can be a challenge. And when we get there, when we get to the place where you can listen to what the relationship is and not to like what the script says it's allowed to be and not allowed to be, it has been for me and for like so many allosexual people in my life really, really immensely liberating. And that's one thing that I think I was afraid of as a younger ace person was, oh, I'm going to disappoint my partners. Like the fact that like they might care about me, they might be excited about me, and then the fact that I can't be or don't want to be sexual with them is going to be this like limitation and disappointment. And what I found is that far, far more than that's the case, the fact that we get to have relationships that are sort of liberated from these scripts is really, really exciting. Like the allosexual people in my life find relationship with me as an ace person like way more liberating than it is disappointing because it complements the sexual romantic relationships they're forming, and it provides all of this new possibility about how to take every other relationship that they have more seriously.
If
Yeah.
if there's one thing that you would have wanted your younger self to know, or I'm sure there could be more than one, but if there's one thing that you'd want to share with a younger version of yourself, do you know what that would be?
It's tough to say. I mean, I really want the younger version of myself to know that it'll be okay. I think the family I've formed, the ACE community, the like global ACE community that's been able to form, are all things that my younger self dreamed of that are sort of have happened beyond its wildest expectations, his wildest expectations. And and I think the other thing, like I couldn't see when I was struggling with loneliness, I couldn't see when I was in it, is that relationship, if I can swear once, is really fucking powerful. Like it doesn't just, make me feel good and create opportunities in my life. Like it creates immense creativity. It creates economic opportunity. It creates political power. And these skills that I learned to connect just in my life, I've used to pass laws. I've used to like mess with the inside of social media companies, get to change their policies. I've used to take on big
Wow.
pharma and win. Like
Yeah.
there's all of these things that kind of open up in the world when we learn to see and kind of tap into this power of relationship. And so I think knowing that that's there and being hopeful about that is a thing that I would want my younger self to know.
And sort of in the same, I guess, tone of reflecting, how have you seen the ACE community change over time since you were first kind of connecting with people, back in the 90s? Like, how have you witnessed it shift since then?
So I think when we first emerged, I started my website in 2001. This was right when Google was coming into widespread usage to like really age myself. And so in if you type the word asexual into a pre-Google search engine, you would get like a bunch of papers on plant biology. And I happened to
Wow.
put my website up right at the moment when you could type the word asexual into Google and find other asexual people. And my website was the place that we found one another. And
Awesome.
so there was a really powerful moment for me, for so many of the people finding the community for the first time, of just like not feeling broken, having spent years struggling with this part of ourselves and suddenly finding that we weren't alone was immensely powerful. And so that early community had this newness, this rawness to it, and this question about just like, what is this experience? How do we understand aceness? How do we understand the sexual world, the allosexual world, and navigate it? And now it feels like there's a lot of ways that we've matured as a community. We are international. We had a big set of conferences in India this year.
Amazing.
And we have really embraced our diversity. So I think there was, in some ways, a narrower understanding because there was a narrower group of people who identified as ace. And now all of the ways that aceness shows up really differently in different cultural contexts, in with different intersection identities, as it intersects with trans identity, as it intersects with, here in the States, Black identity. I think there's a much deeper, richer understanding of that intersection in our community. There's a richer understanding of diversity. So we were just the asexual community then. Now we're the ace community because we recognize that gray A people, demisexual people, aromantic people all have a place. And I think there was a decision early on that we made where that said the word asexual is a tool and not a label. So if it's useful, pick it up and use it. If it stops being useful, put it down. If it would be more useful if you like put a sparkly tassel on it, put a sparkly tassel on it. It does need to look the same for everyone. And that led to this, I think, explosion of language that was more accurate to people's lived experience. And we've become really diverse for that reason. I think that is beautiful. We've also become so much more integrated with the queer community. We're recognized and respected now in queer space in a way that we weren't before. And that's really huge. So I think there's ways that we've matured, we've diversified, we've established ourselves, and we're still grappling with these cultural questions of how to be seen as not broken, how to let the world know that I think there's a way that many allosexual people still feel like if they don't date, if they're not attractive enough, if they're not sexual enough, then they're going to fall off a cliff into an abyss. I think that there's still a real fear that a lot of people have, and I think that there's still work for our community to do, for us to do sort of in allyship to help to assuage that fear, to pull it back. Because I think if we lived in a world where people were just sexual when they wanted to be, right, and not because they felt like they had to be, like that would be a beautiful thing.
If that wasn't like the default expectation, if you could walk up to it and pick it up if you wanted to, but it wasn't like everyone assumed that everyone was already wanting to engage in that or should engage in that.
And if you meet someone, you feel excited about them, there's not this assumption that, oh, well, we're going to be sexual or like maybe nothing's going to happen. There was a real question of what does the excitement want to be? What are all the places this relationship could go, and which of those places are most exciting to us?
It doesn't have to be such a binary. It can be like looking, at this, I guess, like spectrum in the middle, seeing exactly. In between. And just sort of as we approach the end of the podcast, I wanted to ask you, because you've written a book, and I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Relationality: How Moving from Transactional to Transformational Relationships Can Reshape Our Lonely World. And something that it's been a real theme in this conversation is loneliness and the ways in which we're in the middle of a global loneliness crisis. And so as someone who thinks and reflects a lot about relationship, I've really begun to explore how we create the conditions for relationship in our world, how we invite people out of loneliness. And so the book touches on some of these things about aceness and asexuality, but it's really more about that, how we invite people out of loneliness, and I think more pointedly, how we invest money in that. Something I've observed as a community organizer is that often the work of building a relationship is the most powerful work to do, but it's really, really hard to fund. For some reason, when you start talking about that work to philanthropists or to other people in institutions, it kind of like turns to vapor. And so the book is really looking at why we fail to fund this work of building relationship that we all really, really need, and how the world would pretty radically change if we learned how to support that work.
It's interesting because I remember I've read a study recently where this was referenced in some news article about how loneliness is it as bad for you as smoking 7 cigarettes a day or something by
Yeah.
that comparison?
And one of the things that came out of the research for this book is how many things get worse when we become lonely and how many things get better when we're in relationship. So relationship is correlated not just with physical health, which you mentioned, not just with mental health, which is kind of obvious. It's the strongest indicator discovered of economic mobility. It's one of the strongest predictors of educational attainment, one of the strongest predictors of creative and artistic community. It's the strongest predictor of whether a community will survive a natural disaster.
Wow.
And there's studies that show that relationships between people in different scientific fields is the strongest predictor of scientific breakthroughs.
Wow.
And in a world where, there's a very noted slide from democracy into autocracy that's happening globally. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the strength of our relationship, the strengths of our communities of care is one of the greatest factors in supporting democracy and undermining autocracy. So when we can, yeah.
And as someone who, I mean, because obviously, your relationships are very intentional, but I wonder, even though you've done all this work and after writing your book, was there something that you learned that's actually again shifted the way that you think about connection and relationships in your own life? Like, did writing it kind of like flip a switch for you in another way?
One thing I learned writing the book, I was talking about communities of care, and I was just struck by how much care seems to be at the center of so many things. Like we talked about, date, have a career, have a community of care, right? Those communities of care historically are where social movements come from.
Okay.
Those communities of care are what allow people to start small businesses as entrepreneurs. Those communities of care are what builds different forms of political power. And so the centrality of care and like the things that come from us knowing how to be a little more intentional with people in our lives and like know how to show up for one another, like that just really amazed me. And then another thing that I think I've learned since writing the book, I've started talking to people who are global peace builders. So they like go into conflict zones around the world to try to de-escalate them.
Okay.
And the thing that they talk about, which I also see happening at a local community level, I also see happening in our intimate relationships, is that they say conflict is a really good thing.
Okay.
We need conflict that is generative. We need conflict where we disagree and we know how to disagree in a container that results in us understanding and trusting one another more rather than resenting ourselves. And often toxic conflict happens because conflict is being avoided and boiled over. Like that's what happens at national levels, and that's what happens in individual relationships. So in addition to care, the thing I've been thinking a lot about is generative conflict. How do we love and create spaces for the conflicts in our lives so that they don't wind up tearing our relationships apart?
That's a masterclass I'd love to take. I think navigating communication and relationships is time and time again one of those things that I really wish there was. You go to school, you learn about math and chemistry and English and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, relationships and people would have been such a valuable course to have. Obviously, you can't learn everything in one class, but just to have some kind of foundational building blocks to go off of, and learning how to engage in conflict in a constructive and generative way as well would be one of those things that would be so useful.
I think that's true, and I think we learn about relationship more in our extracurriculars because the most powerful relationships are the ones with people who share some passion of ours,
yes.
right? Who see a side of ourselves that kind of get us in a way that other people don't get us. And so if you're a theater kid, if you're a music kid, if you're a sports kid, right? Like those are the opportunities for you to learn conflict, for you to learn care, for you to learn connection. But I'd love to see that be a little more intentional for like those extracurricular communities to be a little bit more structured in how they do that teaching.
And so, just as a final question, is there anything that I haven't asked that you wish I had, or like a final message that you'd want to share with our listeners?
Just to any ACE listeners out there, to any people out there who know ACE folks, like, I just want to say you're not broken if you're afraid you're broken. You're not going to be alone if you're afraid you're going to be alone. Like, there is so much possibility for relationship and connection out there. And I think that there is a hunger for the kind of liberation that as ace people, we have to practice as a tool of survival. Not that we're the only ones who can do it. And so I think what I'd say is like, trust in yourself, trust in your journey to connect people, and know that you have something to offer that is precious, that is going to be like so deeply valued and empowering to the people around you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David, for your time today and for speaking with me and answering all of my questions. It's been so lovely to chat with you. And just for our listeners too, I'll be putting a link where you can find David's book in the description, and maybe to your website. Is that the best place for people to find you?
Yes, asexuality.org is a great place to point people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Much appreciated having you here. It was a great honor on our part, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, too. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before we sign off, we wanted to ask you for your help. Because we talk about sex, we keep getting shadow banned across a whole bunch of social media platforms. And that not only makes it hard for people to find us, but it sends the message that sex isn't okay to talk about. Not only is sex okay to talk about, it's totally essential. Because more knowledge equals better outcomes for all of us across a whole bunch of different measures. You can make a difference, and what we need from you is your active support. So please follow the podcast and consider checking out our social channels too: Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, whatever takes your fancy. You can find us at sexandspace.com and click on our social links from there. Help us make sex an okay space. Thank you for taking the Sex and Space trip with us, and until next time, safe travels, and we'll see you on the next intergalactic episode.